this is Evelyn Lopez. Welcome to Sustainability in Your Ear, the Earth911.com podcast for the week of December 10th, 2018. We are recording at the very festive Moonyard recording studio in Tacoma, Washington. As we near the end of 2018, we wanted to look back at the biggest environmental and sustainability news of the year and also look ahead to 2019. So this is our backwards and forwards episode. So I am alone with Doug at the Moonyard Studios. That means everyone else is calling in from remote locations. Mitch Ratcliffe, our Earth911 publisher, where are you today?
Oh, I'm in my home office, preserving my emissions.
Oh, very, very good. Is it cold there? Can you see frosty trees out your window?
Yeah, today was, I think, the first hard frost. It might have been yesterday.
Yeah, I agree. It's just starting to feel like winter. We also have Earth911 writers Sarah Lozanova and Trey Granger with us today. Sarah, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Great. How are things in Maine? Is that where you are today?
Yeah, I am. I'm in beautiful mid-coast Maine, and things are nice and calm and peaceful here.
Oh, good. Good.
Have you had any more snow days yet?
We haven't. We've only had a handful so far. So we're in a lull.
Maybe you'll have a white Christmas, though. That would be nice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Also, Trey Granger. Trey, where are you at today?
I am in sunny Arizona, although it's kind of cold here. It's below 60 degrees, which is cold for us.
You got to break out the long underwear.
Pretty much. I'm wearing a sweater right now.
I know.
A sweater in Arizona.
Yeah.
Once in a lifetime experience.
Well, it gets chilly in the evenings at this time of year. So before we get into our backwards and forwards, let's talk a little bit about the recent Earth911 surveys. Mitch, what did we survey recently?
Well, we do these surveys just to kind of capture a sense of what Earthlings care about and are thinking about. And on Thanksgiving, we asked the question, what would you value most in a future sustainable economy? In other words, what principles and values would you like to see? And it was an interesting result, and one I'm intrigued by. So we asked first, and I wanted to include some questions that allowed people with a variety of perspectives to participate. And the first, the lowest response we got, 6% of people said that they want freedom of choice in what my family and I buy and use.
That's interesting.
I think this is one of the pivotal issues in the discussion between the deniers and the people who recognize the reality of climate change. Is the deniers are afraid of what they're going to lose. And so, and we'll be talking a little later about some of that as well. 9% of people said that they want equal opportunity for all. In other words, an equitable planet that is sustainable. Then at 17%, people want responsible production practices and transparency in business, which ties into their the biggest finding, which was a desire for a national or a global anti-pollution and recycling policy. The next one was 12% of folks want local self-sufficiency and sustainability. So that's an expression of regional and local organization as an alternative to what we see as globalization. And I think that's the other place we're probably seeing some of the recent converts from denialism to recognizing the reality. And I may be over-interpreting here, but, that's how it is. And finally, a global perspective on climate with a local focus on health, education, and policy came in at 21%. So that was number 2. 35% want that national or global recycling and anti-pollution policy that encourages sustainability. So more than 50% of our readers are looking at this from a perspective of what we would call global and local solutions. And I think that's very realistic. And the reason is there are no boundaries in climate change. We tend still to look at this as a question of whether or not the state of Washington, the state or the U.S. or North America could solve this problem on its own, and it's not going to happen. So these global views are interesting and refreshing to see, but I think we've got a long way to go to bring a lot of people along with it. So this was I thought it was a really interesting set of results. In our next survey, we asked, will your next home be larger or smaller? And that survey is just about done, so I don't have the data yet.
Yeah. The thing that I thought was interesting with the larger answers that people seem to want global perspectives or national global policies is that I think people really do want some kind of big, and I'll say government focus on these issues, and they do want some consistency. I think people are calling out for that. And I think it may be a while before we get that, but I think, there may be other options that people need to sort of content themselves with while the global sort of starts coalescing.
Well, we're ignoring the Paris Accords as a country.
Yes.
But we also have the first bipartisan sustainable climate action in Congress right now. It doesn't stand a chance of passing because the Senate is controlled by the Republicans. But it is at least the beginning of a dialogue, and we should be happy about that, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. So interviews on our website, I know we were talking offline about a number of interviews that you've got ready to launch in the near future, but currently the recent interview that's on the website is the one we did with the CEO of Zest Labs, Peter Mehring. And we've talked about that before, but this is a good interview simply because it kind of takes you more from the really down to the grassroots production level of what can you do to preserve fresh food for as long as you can, and what kind of data can you manage so that, let's say, if your lettuce does sit out in the sun for 2 hours before it gets to the processing facility, you can make some determinations about maybe that lettuce should go straight to restaurants and not go into the retail sphere. So I thought it was a pretty good interview.
Yeah, I think that the fact that we can use data to rethink the management of the food supply is critical to understand. A lot of people think we don't need technical solutions, but technical solutions can augment our ability to do the better natural thing.
Mm-hmm. So what are some other interviews that we'll have coming up through the end of this year?
Well, we have, just before this podcast releases, we have Dr. Kinnary Webb, who is the founder of Health and Harmony, which is a great interview. I really enjoyed talking with her. She's been working since 2005 to reduce illegal logging in Borneo and has reduced the number of households that depend on illegal logging down to, by 88%.
Wow.
And coincidentally, now there are only about 88 illegal loggers left in Borneo. And they're slowly buying all their chainsaws and going into business with them doing sustainable forestry. They've also, in the same time, managed to reduce under 5 mortality rates by 90%. So they're making a tremendous difference in Borneo and with regard to the rainforest, which has recovered more than 20,000 hectares with regrowth.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
So I encourage everybody to go back and take a listen to that. It will be on the Friday prior to our release.
Okay, excellent. So speaking of backwards and forwards, what would you say were some of the most interesting interviews you've done this year, Mitch?
Well, maybe it's just recency, but I thought Kinnary Webb's was great.
Mm-hmm.
Leslie Field, the founder of Earth911, was a fascinating conversation, and she's working to provide a solution to reflect light in the Arctic region so that we can encourage nature to produce more multi-year ice, which is more reflective.
Yeah. Well,
going back over the rest of the year, I also enjoyed Peter Fikowski's discussions of carbon capture.
That's actually the one that I keep going back to. I think the ideas were really interesting. The idea of, getting more iron into the oceans to reoxidize them. I liked that a lot.
Well, and I keep in touch with Peter, and they're making a lot of progress. So this is a movement that I think we're going to see come to fruition starting in 2019.
Great. Well, I think one of the things that I really appreciate about our interviews is that you actually do one-on-ones with some of the leaders in various environmental fields and with leaders in environmental industries. And I think that gives people an opportunity to actually hear, real stories from real people doing real things. That's good.
Reality is not overrated.
Nope, reality is a good thing. So getting into our stories, looking backwards on big stories for 2018 and looking forwards to what we think might be big in 2019, let's start by talking about our podcast. Mitch, we launched this earlier this year in 2018, and what were we trying to do?
Well, first and foremost, we wanted to start to talk with our readers. And we've always had Earthling questions, which have consistently been interesting. And the idea, of course, has evolved since we started. I really enjoy these group conversations, but the individual interviews have been popular as well. So we're getting great feedback. And one of the things that's helped Earth911 do, I can say this as the publisher, is raise its flag. And we are getting calls from more companies and more organizations that are interested in being on the show and being on the site. So we're really encouraged by what's going on.
Good.
Hey, Mitch, I can pose a challenge to our listeners and readers for next year. Those Earthling questions, they're largely targeted towards recycling. And I would love it if people were asking questions about climate change or renewable energy or all the other sorts of topics that are covered on the site, because there's a lot of great information out there that they probably have questions about.
Yeah, that's interesting because we really only collect that feedback in and around the search articles, or on the search, I should say, and that's a great challenge. Let's see how we can build that discussion.
Mm-hmm. Well, looking back at the last year, before we get into the stories that we featured on our website, what were some of the bigger stories, do you think, from 2018 in sort of the general environmental climate change world arena? Mitch, what would you say are some of the bigger national global stories?
Well, the IPCC report, which came out about 3.5 months ago, it's a global report. It is clear that we have roughly 12 years and as few as 4 to really begin to respond to the increase in temperature, which is about just has eclipsed 1 degree centigrade. That was a benchmark moment, which was an exclamation point was put on it by the U.S. government's recent climate assessment, which was found that we are going to see 10% GDP decline at minimum by the end of the century due to climate change and widespread extreme weather damage. And unfortunately, the other component of that story is that the administration ignored it and said that it's all blown out of proportion. So those are the big stories for me.
Yeah. Trey, what about you?
The big one from my perspective is this China ban on recycling. For those who are living under a rock and weren't aware, China is the largest collector of U.S. recyclables. And they are our number, as far as quantity, our number 4 export to China is actually waste and scrap, about $5 billion up until last year. But because we were having high contamination rates, China started saying, you know what, we're going to stop taking this stuff from you guys. And the U.S. has had a really tough time figuring out what to do with a lot of our recyclables as a result. Things are piling up in warehouses. They're going to landfills. States are lifting their landfill bans in order to put stuff in landfills. And we just haven't determined what to do with all this stuff that was going to China before.
Yeah.
Sarah, what about you? What was sort of the, aside from what we have on our Earth911 website, was there anything that, struck you over the last year as kind of a game-changing moment?
I would say, I would echo what Mitch said about the IPCC report, because I found that really sobering, but at the same time saying, hey, we need to get in action and act now. And I think that's really the message, the takeaway message that I think really resonates with me, and that we need to just take action and get busy.
So there's a question for everybody. Is government the answer to this question?
Well, and we had some discussions leading up to this about some of the recent attempts to put some legislation in place. I know Washington State had a citizens initiative this last fall, 1631, that would have set up a carbon tax and had
First in the nation.
First in the nation, had numerous other provisions, and it was a very big and complex proposed piece of legislation. And it was brought to the voters through a citizen initiative, which means you've got to gather, 500,000 signatures to get it on the ballot. And it did not pass. And I think the reason is because first, it was complicated. Anything that's very complicated and has a scientific component tends to throw voters for a loop. And then the industry, particularly the fossil fuel industry and big oil interests, put literally millions and millions and millions of dollars into the ad campaign against it. And that's a recipe for big voter confusion. So I'm hoping that that's not the end of it. I think there will be some components. I know there's already zero emissions, but I'm not sure I've got that right, plan in Olympia that they're looking at. I'm hoping that there are pieces from that continue to move forward in different arenas.
Sarah, what do you think?
I think in some cases it is. And I think, like what Evelyn said, I think a lot of times it's people taking action that really makes a difference. And that's putting a lot of pressure on corporations, for example. Like now a lot of major corporations are purchasing renewable energy directly from wind projects and from solar energy projects. And I think that is in direct response to consumer demand. So I think government can be part of the solution, but administrations don't always support environmental initiatives. And when that's the case, then I think it's good to really focus on some of the other ways that we can really leverage change.
Yeah, I think that's really an important point. Governments do not move quickly. And then
actually one of their virtues, too.
It can be. It definitely can be, because sometimes, it takes a while to sort out all of the intricacies and all of the ramifications of these laws. But I think when you look at some of the big manufacturers, even car manufacturing, they're pretty much ignoring what they're seeing from the Trump administration. The Trump administration may be saying we don't need to have any kind of goals for mileage. We don't need to have any goals for electrical vehicles. But the big companies know that the consumer demand will be there. It's there now. It will increase. And so they're planning to meet that demand so that they can stay successfully in business and not be, overcome by other, foreign automobile manufacturers. And I think that that's just our reality. Is that it would be great if government could take the lead, but I don't think we're going to see that happen.
No, and in fact, that was why GM discontinued in several cars and shut down those plants. Is they said explicitly, we have to pivot to electric vehicles or we will not survive. So it's they are pragmatism does rule in business, and I think it also rules in local communities. People get together and solve their problems. How do we organize so that we can extend those solutions in regional or national ways is an interesting question. It may not include government.
Right. I think.
How about you, Trey?
Yeah, Trey. There was an Arizona law on the books also, wasn't there, on the up for election?
Yes. In November, there was a law that would have required 50% renewable energy by 2030, and it also was unsuccessful, just like Washington's green law. But Nevada did pass one, the same type of law, that 50% by 2030. So I think, as you guys have mentioned, slowly government will solve the problem. But as Mitch mentioned before, these recent reports are showing that in the next 4 to 12 years, the action needs to happen. So the question is, will consumers and businesses continue to put up that fight to make things happen before government can?
Mm-hmm.
I think unsustainable practices by corporations really are a liability as well, because they don't necessarily know what future legislation there will be. So I think the more sustainable companies can become, the less liability they have in the long term when there are new regulations that limit emissions or energy efficiency targets and the like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that you're hitting the nail on the head. They're going to manage this as a risk. And by making these investments in sustainability, they're going to ensure that they've got access to materials they need because they're recycling them, and they're going to be reducing their reliance on fossil fuels, which is going to destroy the environment in which they have to operate.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes nonprofit organizations will target companies that have particularly unsustainable practices. Like that's happened quite a bit in the restaurant industry, for example, or with food companies that have undesirable animal welfare initiatives. And so I think also it's a liability to have kind of dark secrets, about sustainability.
Well, and transparency is something that, Earth911 can help with. We're trying to do that more in 2019. At your recent electric vehicles article, we want to help people understand when they are making a decision, what the impact on the environment is.
Well, that's a pretty good segue into looking back at our stories. Mitch, looking back over the last year on climate change and environmental protection, what stories were significant to you?
Well, there are several that are examples of climate change that we reported on. One was a recent contribution by Earth911. I mentioned Leslie Field earlier, and Roman Decca on her team wrote a story about how Arctic ice actually affects our everyday life. 80% of the ice in the Arctic has disappeared since 1979. And that's bad in a number of ways, but one of the most fundamental things to understand about the ice is that first-year ice that freezes up in the fall and through the winter, does not reflect anywhere near as much light as multi-year ice. It's a difference of 20% to 80% of the light being reflected. So that's a very important impact, and it's changing, for instance, the jet stream, which is why we're having more extreme weather in North America and across northern Europe. I don't think people can deny, especially after Superstorm Sandy, the incredible wildfire season that we've just been through in the West, both up in Canada and in California, as well as Hurricane Florence, where we saw a lot of low-lying country inundated, and including cattle feed manure ponds that were resulted in massive toxic pollution. So we're looking at the consequences of climate change every day. We don't always recognize that it's tied to it, but this extreme weather, these extreme fire events are all pointers to the fact that climate change is really happening. There's no theory about this. It's here. And as another interesting story was, and it's relatively small and something that you don't think about, but Hawaii's East Island was literally wiped off the map. It wasn't a big island, but it was a nature preserve. Hurricane Walaka back in October came through and literally removed the island from the surface of the ocean. This is what will happen on the coastlines of the United States and the coastlines of every other part of the world. And of course, 60% of our population lives within 100 miles of the coast. So this is going to have a huge impact on migration as people retreat from these areas and look for somewhere else to live, as well as on just the health and safety and diversity of the environment around us. And then, the other story that I would point to is that we are getting a lot more information on which we can make decisions. So I would point to our story, 8 books that every environmentalist should read in 2018. It was a piece that Lauren Murphy did for us. It covers a number of books that are giving us better insight into how to help change our own behavior, change our community's behavior, and have these discussions about national and international policy. So check that out. My favorite read of the year, and it actually doesn't come from 2018, is Drawdown, a book assembled by Paul Hawken, the entrepreneur who did Smith & Hawken many years ago, the hardware store. But Kiss the Ground, How the Food You Eat Can Reverse Climate Change, Heal Your Body, and Ultimately Save Your World by Josh Tickle was one book that stood out for me from Lauren's list. Getting to Green, Saving Nature, a Bipartisan Solution by Frederick Rich. There's a lot of conversation going on, and this is really encouraging. So that's where I see, looking back, what's going on. Looking forward, I think we've got 2 things we've got to recognize. And the first is there is a backlash against the recognition of climate change. The most pressing example of that is going on right now in France. The French government instituted a carbon tax earlier this year. Emmanuel Macron, their president, decided to do this in order to start to wean France off fossil fuels, and it's very much needed. Unfortunately, the French really know how to do revolution.
Yeah.
And so the yellow vest movement, and that comes from the fact that every automobile in the country has to have a yellow vest in it, reflective yellow vest, that you put on when you have a breakdown. Oh. But these folks took their yellow vests and went out and started burning cars and trashing buildings in Paris over the course of the last couple of weeks.
I saw some pictures from that, and it's like wild. I mean, they're really huge mobs rioting. And of ordinary people. This is not any extreme. It's a wide range of or wide swath of society that is responding to these taxes as though they're unfair, but they don't recognize that it's also designed to help them in the future. And that short-termism is the thing that we're going to be fighting against in 2018. It's going to get more extreme, and I believe here in the United States too. But I also believe that we're going to see the beginning of that pragmatic realization that even though we're fighting about this, something is going on that we all have to pull together to change. And so while maybe that is the hopeful way to portray this, that dialogue and the information that I was talking about being increasingly available gives me hope for 2019. And I expect to see both a backlash and the beginning of genuine progress. I hope so. That would be good. So turning to some of our key recycling issues, Trey, what sort of stories stuck out for you in the recycling arena and changes and adjustments that we've been making in our recycling?
So I mentioned earlier the China ban, and there are some great stories on the website about that. I covered in great detail. That Earth911 did a fantastic job this year of covering that story. I wrote a story a couple of months ago about what is recyclable in the United States. And this has always been a pet peeve of mine when industry groups come out and state that something is recyclable or try to set mandates that a product meets the definition of recyclable if it hits these certain aspects. And the honest to gosh truth is, in America, there is no standard for what is or isn't recyclable. It's all about the local market. So I really try to drill down into explaining how if you live in an area where you don't have curbside access or drop-off access for a material, it's not recyclable to you, even if the majority of the country can recycle it. Things like glass bottles that the majority of the public would just assume, it's recyclable. There are plenty of areas out there where there's just no facility that can process that material. So they just don't collect glass. And as a result, these areas, glass is not recyclable. So to me, it's all about changing that perception of when industries and manufacturers are talking about the greenness of their products, really reaching out to all American citizens and ensuring that they're not using messaging that can be misconstrued. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight, back in April, it was actually our 48th anniversary of Earth Day. So I wrote an article for the 48 eco-friendly innovations since Earth Day began, and just tried to break out, because 1970 was obviously a long time ago, but if you show all the things that the U.S. has actually accomplished since 1970, it's pretty impressive. Everything from the creation of the EPA to complex fluorescent light bulbs, to Energy Star and the U.S. Green Building Council, telecommuting. There's a lot of great things that we as a country have embraced and created so that the U.S. can be more green and more caring about our environment.
I thought those were really good stories. So what do you think we'll see in 2019?
The big thing for me is I see more of an emphasis on using recycled content from manufacturers. California was actually trying to push through a bill. It eventually, I believe, didn't go through, but I can't find any sources to back this up. It was supposed to go through in September that would mandate manufacturers use a minimum of 35% recycled content for any sort of packaging. And they didn't even take it to a vote from consumers. It was going to go entirely to the governor without any sort of consumer weigh-in. I think you're going to start to see more states weigh in on these aspects of how can we get manufacturers to use more recycled content. And then you also saw at the G7 summit back in September, companies like Coke and Walmart, they committed to reduce plastic pollution in the oceans by saying in 2030, 100% of our packaging will be recyclable. So again, it goes back to the idea of what does recyclable mean? But the great thing there is they recognize that if they're making products that are not highly reusable and highly valuable in that recycling stream, they're not going to achieve that goal. So you're going to start to see, I believe, as soon as next year, more of these companies say, you know what, we're putting more recycled content into these products. So we need that content. We need people to recycle more and recycle better to make sure we're getting that great material.
That's interesting. So it will be maybe a spur to get more people actively recycling because they need that material.
Absolutely. And consumers should be looking on that packaging. Does it say it's recycled content?
Mm-hmm. Very good. Interesting. Well, what about energy efficiency? Sarah, what were big stories for you on sort of energy efficiency products or businesses?
Yeah, I would say one that was particularly interesting to research was greening the cloud with renewable energy. Mm-hmm. And when I wrote this, I looked largely at the 2017 Clicking Green report by Greenpeace, and they ranked the greenest internet companies. And Apple and Google were kind of at the top of the list, with WhatsApp and Instagram and iTunes and LinkedIn. And then it gets into some of the companies that had more mediocre scores like Amazon and eBay and Etsy. And the takeaway message that I got is that we can support these companies that are using more renewable energy. And then we can also voice our opinions to the companies that had lower rankings and encourage them to implement renewable energy initiatives and energy efficiency improvements.
I was going to ask you, do you think, were you struck by the fact that many of the newest companies were the least sustainable on that list? To me, that really stood out.
Yeah, and you would think that some of the newer companies might be more likely to be more innovative. But I think sometimes, too, making relationships and creating power purchase agreements from wind farms and things like that can take some time. Like it often takes a few years to get a wind farm through the development phase. So I think some of that might also be a lag time.
Just a function of their youth.
Yeah. And then I think also as they become more well-established, then it's probably easier to, their name means more when they enter into agreements.
Sure.
They have more of a credit history. Another interesting story that I covered is how the digital world can encourage healthy living. And there was a recent study by the market research company Capgemini, and they put out a guide for retailers and manufacturers on encouraging healthy living. And this I thought was a really great idea because a lot of stores have apps and things like that, and they're subtly influencing our purchasing choices, by what's on sale or what they're promoting and things like that. And so really helping consumers to zero in on healthier products or even encouraging a healthy lifestyle like walking or exercising, losing weight, things like that, instead of just trying to get us to consume. I think that is a really encouraging idea. And it also encourages companies to be more responsible for the impact that they're having on us.
I was going to say some of the stories that I really appreciated that you did this last year were on the solar panels. I think you've almost encouraged me. I think I'm going to look into getting them on my house because of it just made it so much more accessible to be able to read, sort of down to earth articles on how easy it is.
Yeah, the prices are really dropping, and it depends a little bit on where you live as far as the payback period. But I live in Maine, and we don't have we're kind of middle of the road, or maybe not even in the greatest category for solar. And a lot of the systems here have about an 8 to 10 year payback, and in states like California or Hawaii, they can have a much shorter payback. So I think solar makes a lot of sense because we know that we're going to be powering our homes with electricity, 10 years from now. So it's a great way to use clean energy. Mm-hmm. And a lot of towns are also installing solar systems as well and powering their town offices and things like that with solar. So that's also a really encouraging trend that I've been seeing this year.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of government, from our conversation a few minutes ago, one of the interesting things that I learned this year as I was investigating solar on my home is that in the state of Washington, the incentive program is exhausted, and we have to wait for the legislature, which might take 8 to 12 months to do so, to refund the incentive program. And so for the time being, the 40% savings that is promised in Washington State just isn't available. And that's an area where I think we can make a big change in longer-term funding of these programs, with the recognition that we are trying to get to that goal of everybody being electric-powered by 2030.
Yeah, and I think the incentives, sort of the boom and bust cycle of the incentives, has really had a rippling effect on the renewable energy industry, because there has been a lot of policy instability. Like even the ITC, which is the federal tax credit for solar, that's come and gone, and it's gotten renewed at the last minute, and it makes it really hard for solar installers to plan. Should they be hiring and training more solar installers, or should they be letting people go? Because if there's a 30% tax credit, that has a huge impact on the net price of a solar system, and so it really has an effect on sales.
Well, now one of the interesting things this year was that people raced to stock up on panels prior to the tariffs, and that resulted in a lot of additional installation this year. Do you see the tariffs actually sort of undercutting the market next year?
I don't know that the tariffs have had as big of an impact as you might think. I do some work with a local solar installer here, Sundog Solar, and I know we've been purchasing solar panels from India. And then I guess also in China, they've cut back on some of their solar incentives. So there was actually a lot of kind of the opposite of the supply shortages we were seeing before. There was sort of a oversupply of solar panels. And so that also created a price drop. So I think because we're part of a global economy, some of these policies that seem like they would be more detrimental haven't necessarily been.
Oh, that's good to see.
Mm-hmm. That is good. That's good news. So what's your prediction in this area for 2019?
Well, I think as far as solar energy, it's the last year that the federal tax credit's going to be in effect at 30%. Mm-hmm. And so it's a great time for businesses and homeowners to go solar. So I think we might see a little push as people take advantage of that. In 2020, it's going to begin tapering down, but gradually. So I think that was actually smart from a planning perspective. And then I think also just corporations utilizing renewable energy. Like I keep reading press releases about companies like Smucker is buying wind power from a project in Nebraska, things of that nature. So I don't think it's just internet companies. More and more retailers and manufacturers are also buying renewable energy directly from the source. I think that's really exciting. And they can also save a lot of money that way. So it's in their financial best interest as well.
So, Evelyn, we haven't heard from you yet. What are you doing?
Wow. So I always sort of pick the lifestyle type stories. There was a newspaper reporter I know who talked about, newspapers, you have the hard news, then you have the corn. And I always go for the corn. So over the last year, we had a number of really great articles. So they're sort of in the eco-lifestyle arena. And I wanted to hit on a couple of them. One was Sarah's article back in July about the zero-waste grocery experience. And this I find so intriguing. And we don't really have a zero waste type grocery experience in the Tacoma area. We do certainly have places that have a lot of bins that you can sort of pick up your own stuff, but generally they have plastic bags with them. So I'm taking away from the zero waste grocery experience and the need to bring your own containers, the idea that I'm going to try making some bags out of a very fine fabric, maybe a silk or a polyester that I can use in place of that to when I'm buying my ingredients from the bulk containers. I already put together a couple of cotton. Actually, I think they're linen bags. They're made from old vintage napkins that I use for buying vegetables and fruits, but I need something that's a little bit more fine for grains of rice and oatmeal and things like that. So that's my takeaway, is making my own shopping bags. I also thought that 8 Ways to Green Your Water was a really good article. Steve Udes did this in August. And one of the good ideas from that article was that there is a website, waterfootprint.org, that has a calculator you can use to help determine what your water footprint is, so like your carbon footprint. And it'll ask you questions about the food you eat in addition to your other practices, so you can sort of get some ideas of places where you can reduce. And one of the big reducers, and this is true for any number of different environmental areas, is how much meat you are eating. So one of the things that, I've been trying to do in our household is get a few more meatless entrees on the dinner table with kind of mixed success, frankly. But that's something I'm going to keep working on. The article also talks about, making sure you've got low flow devices, toilets, shower heads, and also, I thought made a good point about making sure you're washing with care. Don't leave the sink running while you wash the dishes. Make sure you have a full dishwasher when you run it. Make sure you run full loads of laundry. So it's little things you can do in your daily life that can make a big difference. And then the last article I wanted to just mention was one that I think the Earth911 staff may have put together. At least that's the attributed author. And it's 10 things you can do today for the environment from October. And this has some really great tips along the lines of trying to reduce your meat consumption. Have salad for lunch today and every day. And I would add to that, you can bring some really great leftovers and salads in mason jars. So I think that's an excellent way to do that. Stop your loss of electricity from stealth devices. Learn to unplug your devices. Use power strips that you can then turn off when you're not using all of the things, so that not everything is just sipping away at your electricity while you're out of the house. And then I also thought there was a really good idea about adopt LED lighting. And this is one where we changed in my house to compact fluorescent lighting a few years ago. And so we've been doing that pretty successfully, but we have not got any LED lighting. So that's going to be my next task, is that next time we need some light bulbs, we'll make the switch over to LED. So those are my takeaways from, articles over this last year.
I just wanted to add to what you said about the LED lights. They've also fallen in price dramatically and improved in quality. Like, I looked into buying some LED lights maybe about 8 years ago, and I was kind of stunned by how expensive they are. And now I had the opposite reaction. Like, they've really become much more affordable, which also makes a bigger impact with the cost savings.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the light quality, too, you mentioned that, is important. My wife just finally said, these LED lights actually are bright and the kind of light that I like. So
good.
She finally bought into it. But the price was prohibitive for so long. Even if you did the math and recognized that in the long term you were going to save a lot of money, a lot of people just never did that.
Right.
And now that the price and the light quality have reached, I think, in fact, are improved over any other bulbs, we're in a good place.
Good. So my prediction for 2019, this is a little bit of a hard one on the lifestyle section area, but I would say that we are going to, or what I hope we'll see, because I think we need to see it, is this, and that is find ways to discuss climate change in a way that makes it real to every person. Right now, I think that these issues have been very scientific, or they've been very political. And so your average family worried about their day-to-day life, worried about getting, the kids off to school, get to the job, do the job, put up with whatever hassles the day may bring, I think it's hard for them to see climate change as an immediate threat. I know that I was watching the Al Gore 24 Hours of Reality program for a little bit, and they seem to be focusing on health impacts of climate change to try to make it real to people, that it does have huge impacts in terms of, especially for children who may have asthma, other respiratory diseases. But I think we still need more ways. We need more ways to make it seem like these are real problems, but there are also some real solutions. So that's what I would like to see in 2019 is more focus on not just this is a problem, but also this is a problem, and here's the solution, something you can do today that will actually have an impact and make everything better. Because I think that's the kind of hope that people need to have.
Yeah, and I think that's tied to recognizing that there are economic opportunities in participating in a sustainable economy, too. To Trey's comments about glass not being recycled.
Yeah. Glass
not being recycled, and that is a valuable material, valuable enough that somebody can figure out a way to make money off it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And in a number of conversations I've had with people about trying to address deniers, they have pointed out that once a denier finds a business opportunity, they don't deny anymore. They may still feel that way, but they don't deny because it's no longer an abstraction to them.
Well, I think, the discussion has been, as you noted at the beginning, sort of takeaway discussions to say, because of climate change, you really shouldn't have air conditioning, or you really shouldn't do this, or you really shouldn't do that. And that's just never going to win the hearts and minds of people. It's tough. I mean, maybe if you really do have a World War II situation, people are willing to make sacrifices for the greater good. But short of that, it's hard. So I think you really need to promote it a little bit differently to, actually everything could be better for all of us if we do some of these things.
Well, and you're hitting on something that's a role that religion has long played. And Pope Francis's Laudato Si encyclical a couple of years ago has catalyzed a lot of discussion in the religious community that could become that kind of mores. These are the things you should and shouldn't do. Mm-hmm. But again, this is a slow process because people are involved. And I do see a tremendous amount of positives as we go forward.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I found so encouraging about the 10 tips that you just went over, Evelyn, is that many of them are relatively small things. If we just put a water-saving shower head on the shower, we can instantly cut our water use and the associated energy use in half of showering, without, you're not saying like shower once a month or something that's really, a major impact on our lifestyle, or, try to turn off the water when you're washing dishes in between when you're using it, or, little things like that where it doesn't really impact our lifestyle, but some of these little habits really can add up quite significantly.
I was on a panel associated with that 24 Hours of Reality, and one of the things that I was talking about was just that, make some small changes that are significant. And one of the ideas was, when we talk about the Meatless Monday, or I'd like to also see maybe a Veggie Wednesday, I can do that in my household, but what if we could get all of our public schools to do that? What if all public schools had Meatless Monday? What if every restaurant in town had a Meatless Monday special? Then you start realizing that could actually be a significant impact.
And again, religion has influenced our diet in a number of ways. So that's why there's clam chowder on Fridays.
That's right.
We just don't think about that stuff. Right now, we're making these changes again.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a great idea. Wednesday.
A Wednesday.
Mm-hmm. One thing I've been thinking of since I live in such a cold climate is just keeping the heat as low as possible while still being comfortable. Mm-hmm. And so now I've been tending to layer up even more in the house. And it's nice because then if I go out and I already have a pair of long johns on, it's more, I'm more likely to go hiking, but it also makes me more comfortable in my house if the heat's a little bit lower than I might normally have it.
Yeah,
and that's a way to really save a lot of energy over the course of a year, just dropping the thermostat a couple degrees in the winter.
Yeah, and the benefit is also financial.
Mm-hmm.
I think what's great about talking about this stuff now is we're getting so close to New Year's when people are planning resolutions. So it's people start thinking about, hey, what can I be doing next year to make changes for the environment?
Well, strange thing, Trey, that will be the subject of our next podcast.
Perfect.
We're all set. We're ready for that.
All right.
So, hey, thanks, everybody. That was a great wrap for our 2019 look back and look forward.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about Earthling questions.
Let's do it.
All right. Barbara in Michigan asks, she says, the gift that keeps on giving. She says, I have a lot of old paint cans in a shed that I inherited from the previous owner of my house. When does latex paint become unrecyclable?
So this was one of 3 versions of this question we got in the last week. So a lot of people are finding paint. Maybe it's the season. Trey, why don't you talk about this? Because you are our paint provocateur.
Yeah, so first off, the only way it would become unrecyclable is if you harden it. So if you put it in kitty litter or some sort of agent that will make it solidified, that is when it's not recyclable anymore. There's no expiration date as far as when paint can't be made into new paint. But there are some great programs out there where you can take your paint for recycling. Many communities, including many in Michigan where Barbara lives, have what's called household hazardous waste collection programs that will take that paint and either allow people to come and pick it up and use it for their own purposes or remix it into new paint.
And so one of the options that we suggested to Barbara as well was Habitat for Humanity. And her concern was that the paint had somehow expired. But in fact, and it was kind of a revelation that no matter how old this stuff gets, it's still potentially recoverable and reusable.
Yeah, I know that Habitat for Humanity at their stores, well, they'll sell partial cans of paint, and it's actually super helpful because sometimes, especially if it's a large developer that's dropping off the cans of paint, it may have the exact paint color that you're hoping to match just to do touch-up work in your house.
That's a great option.
Call your Habitat store first because they do differ based on location. There's no national program for Habitat as far as what they accept.
Okay, very good. So our second question is from Sue on Facebook, and Sue asks, can Earth911 recycle dish TV equipment?
Well, this one is it's an ongoing question. Unfortunately, for several years, many years now, Dish has been telling people that Earth911 actually is a recycler of receivers and the dish itself. But we've never done that. We're a database. Now, what I would encourage everybody to understand about that material is that it is e-waste. It's got electronics. The receiver itself is something that needs to go through an e-waste facility. The dishes, because they're essentially a combination of metal and plastic, could go to most recycling programs. You would probably have to drop it off at your local transfer station. It may not be accepted in your curbside bin. In fact, I don't think you should put it in the curbside bin. But I can't say enough times that if you have a dish TV, we hope that you will recycle it. Unfortunately, we don't recycle it, and we get this question about 4 times a week because Dish continues to tell people this.
So it's Dish's wishful thinking that E911 is the answer to them.
It's a dish wish.
A dish wish. Well, many cities have some place that will take your computer equipment, your old TVs, things like that. And so I would think that would be the likely place where your dish TV could go to be recycled.
Yeah, and there are often quarterly or semi-annual e-waste collection days that you can look for as well.
Okay. Well, that's about it for this episode, but I wanted to add in that if you're still doing some holiday shopping, we have some even more recent stories on the Earth911 website that are really great. Sarah has a story up about products made from ocean plastics. I know Two of those things caught my eye, and I'm going to try to order some as gifts, one for myself, one for my brother. There's also a really nice article on having a green Christmas and low-waste gift wrapping options. And there's also a really nice story on do-it-yourself essential oil gifts that I thought had some great ideas for holidays. So do check those out, especially if you're still in shopping mode. And join us next time to talk about our green resolutions for 2019.
And that'll be on Christmas Eve.
Ooh, Christmas Eve. Exciting. So send your email, your suggestions, your feedback to us at our email, feedback@earth911.com. Stay tuned for future episodes on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spreaker, iHeartRadio, YouTube, and of course at our earth911.com website. And we will see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.